Let's take a look at how the access modifiers affect the usage of our class and its class members. Now I have here basically the same class we looked at earlier, right? Our class flight. It has some fields declared at the top, passengers and seats. It has a constructor. It then has a method add one passenger. And I've also added another method to this called handle too many that gets called from add one passenger. The idea being that when we call add one passenger, if there's not enough seats, add one passenger will call handle too many to do whatever we want to have happen when we have too many passengers. So now let's take this and we'll go ahead and add a public access modifier to class flight. Now what that means, of course, is that we're now allowed to access class flight from anywhere. So we can go out there and declare a variable called flight1 of type flight. I'm going to go ahead and mark the constructor as public as well, which means I'm also allowed to now create instances of this class. We'll talk more about constructors shortly, but the key thing here is that we are allowed to create instances of the flight class. Now let's take our two fields, passengers and seats, and we'll mark those as private. Now as private, they're accessible from within the class, right? So inside of our constructor, we're allowed to access them. Inside that method add one passenger, we're allowed to access them. That's fine. But if from outside the class, we try to do something like we did earlier, like print out the value of passengers, that's no longer allowed, right? That would actually be a compile time error, right? So we wouldn't be allowed to have that code in our program accessing it from outside the class. Now looking at our methods, let's say we mark add one passenger as public and handle too many as private. Well, from outside the class, I'm free to call add one passenger, right? That calls into add one passenger. Add one passenger, if it checks the number of seats, if they're already full, it actually would call down to handle too many, and that would be just fine, right? Because we're accessing the handle too many from within inside of our flight class. But if from the outside we try to call handle too many, again, that would be a compile time error, right? We're not allowed to access it from outside of the class. Now, one thing to note, now that our class is marked as public, remember that earlier I mentioned that the class file for a class normally has the same name as the class. Well, once we mark this class as public, that becomes a requirement. Public classes have to be inside of a source file with the same name. So a public class called flight has to be in a source file called flight.java. Now, if it's not marked as public, that requirement is not in place. Or you're allowed to name the file whatever you want. You always want to be careful about choosing to name the class file something different than the class. There are legitimate reasons to do so, but just consider that carefully.